Our story begins the fatal errors of King 10 royal houses that fell to darkness. In the shadowed halls of history, where marble corridors echo with the whispers of the damned and golden thrones stand empty beneath dust-covered portraits, there exists a truth so dark that chroniclers have spent centuries trying to bury it. Power, they say, corrupts absolutely, but for some royal bloodlines, corruption was merely the beginning. These are the stories of 10 dynasties that didn't simply fall from grace. They were consumed by forces so malevolent, so inexorably destructive, that even now, centuries after their extinction, their very names carry the weight of supernatural dread. From the blood-soaked stones of the Tower of London to the frozen cellars of Ekaterinburg, from the plague-ridden palaces of Vienna to the guillotine-stained squares of Paris, we will walk tonight through the ruins of empires that once commanded the world, only to discover that their destruction came not from external enemies, but from something far more insidious, a curse that seemed to follow royal blood like a shadow, growing stronger with each generation until it consumed everything it touched. These are not merely tales of political failure or military defeat. These are chronicles of dynasties that appeared blessed by heaven itself, only to find themselves trapped in spirals of madness, violence, and genetic horror that would make the darkest folklore seem like children's bedtime stories. Each of these royal houses reached heights of power that seemed to touch the divine, commanded resources that could reshape continents, and wielded authority that made them living gods on earth. Yet each would face an end so complete, so utterly devastating, that their very bloodlines would be erased from the world as if they had never existed at all. The pattern is always the same, yet always unique in its particular horror. First comes the ascension. A dynasty rises through conquest, marriage, or divine mandate, establishing itself as the rightful rulers of vast territories and countless subjects. Then comes the Golden Age, generations of prosperity, cultural achievement, and territorial expansion that seem to confirm heaven's blessing upon the royal bloodline. But always, lurking beneath the silk and ceremony, something dark begins to stir. Perhaps it manifests as madness in the royal children, or as a series of inexplicable deaths that claim heir after heir. Maybe it appears as genetic deformity that grows worse with each generation, or as political disasters that seem to follow the dynasty like a plague. And finally comes the ending, never peaceful, never dignified, but always absolute. Sometimes it arrives as revolution, with royal heads rolling beneath the blade of popular fury. Sometimes it manifests as war, with ancient palaces reduced to rubble and royal bodies left unburied on forgotten battlefields. Occasionally it takes the form of simple extinction, as bloodlines that once seemed destined for eternity simply fade away, leaving behind empty thrones and unanswered questions about what went so terribly wrong. Tonight, we will witness the destruction of kings and queens, emperors and empresses, princes and princesses who believed themselves chosen by God, only to discover that they had been marked instead for something far more terrible. We will walk through palaces where the walls themselves seem to weep with accumulated sorrow, through throne rooms where the very air carries the scent of ancient betrayals, through royal crypts where the dead rest uneasily beneath epitaphs that lie about the true circumstances of their demise. But before we begin our descent into this royal underworld, remember this. These stories are not entertainment. They are warnings. They remind us that no amount of earthly power can protect us from the consequences of our choices, that no throne is high enough to escape the reach of justice, and that some sins echo through generations until they destroy everything they touch. The curse that follows royal blood is not supernatural. It is the inevitable result of absolute power wielded without wisdom, of privilege exercised without responsibility, of human nature twisted by the intoxicating belief that some mortals are more than mortal. So dim the lights, draw the curtains, and prepare yourself for a journey through the darkest chapters of human history. We begin our tale in the fog-shrouded realm of England, where a king's desperate hunger for male heirs would unleash forces that would consume not just his own dynasty, but reshape the very foundations of Western civilization. Chapter 1. The Tudor Catastrophe, when heaven's blessing became hell's curse. The year was 1509, and all of England held its breath as 18-year-old Henry Tudor ascended the throne as Henry VIII, the second monarch of a dynasty that had seized power through conquest and seemed destined to rule for centuries. Tall, athletic, and possessed of the golden charisma that marked him as heaven's chosen champion. Henry embodied everything the medieval world expected from a king. He could joust with the best knights of Europe, compose music that moved courtiers to tears, debate theology with the finest scholars of his age, and command armies with the natural authority of a born conqueror. But behind the magnificent facade, something was already stirring in the Tudor bloodline. A hunger so overwhelming, so consuming, that it would drive Henry to actions that would echo through eternity. The new king had inherited more than just a crown from his father, Henry VII. He had inherited an obsession with dynasty, with the desperate need to secure the succession that had driven the first Tudor to paranoid lengths to eliminate potential rivals. This obsession would grow within Henry VIII like a cancer, feeding on itself until it consumed not just his own soul, but the souls of everyone who came within reach of his desperate need for male heirs. The first sign of the curse that would destroy the Tudors came disguised as blessing. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon in 1509 was celebrated throughout Europe as the perfect union of two Catholic monarchies, a bond that would strengthen England's position in the complex web of continental politics while providing the young king with a queen whose royal bloodline stretched back centuries. Catherine was everything a queen should be: intelligent, pious, politically astute, and deeply committed to her duties as both wife and sovereign. But as the years passed and Catherine's pregnancies ended in miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths, Henry began to interpret these tragedies not as the cruel randomness of fate, but as signs of divine displeasure. Only one child survived, Princess Mary, born in 1516, and while Henry loved his daughter, the medieval world demanded male heirs to ensure dynastic continuity. Each failed pregnancy, each tiny coffin carried from the royal chambers, fed the growing conviction in Henry's mind that his marriage was cursed, that God himself was punishing the Tudor line for some unspecified sin. The transformation of Henry VIII from Renaissance prince to Tudor tyrant began with this theological crisis. Unable to accept that chance might be responsible for his reproductive failures, Henry instead embraced the belief that his marriage to Catherine was invalid in the eyes of God, that he had been living in sin for 20 years without realizing it. This conviction would lead him to break with Rome, establish himself as head of the English Church, and embark on a matrimonial odyssey that would leave a trail of blood across 16th-century Europe. Anne Boleyn, the dark-eyed temptress who captured Henry's obsession in the late 1520s, represented everything that Catherine was not. Where Catherine was conventional, Anne was revolutionary. Where Catherine was submissive, Anne was defiant. Where Catherine had failed to produce sons, Anne promised to give Henry the male heirs that would secure the Tudor succession for generations to come. But Anne Boleyn also brought with her something that would prove far more dangerous than her revolutionary politics or her sexual allure. She brought the curse that would destroy the Tudor dynasty. The curse manifested immediately. Henry's pursuit of and required him to break with 1,000 years of Catholic tradition, splitting England from Rome and establishing a new church with himself as its supreme head. This rupture would unleash religious conflicts that would rage for generations, turning England into a battlefield where Catholic fought Protestant, where families were torn apart by religious differences, and where the very concept of religious unity that had bound medieval society together was shattered forever. But the religious revolution was only the beginning. Anne's pregnancy, which had been the justification for Henry's break with Rome, produced not the promised son but another daughter, Elizabeth, born in 1533. The disappointment was crushing, but Henry convinced himself that sons would follow. They didn't. Instead, Anne suffered a series of miscarriages that drove Henry into rages so violent that courtiers feared for their lives whenever the king learned of another failed pregnancy. The curse reached its first crescendo in 1536, when Henry decided that Anne, like Catherine before her, must be guilty of some sin that was preventing God from blessing their union with male heirs. But where Catherine had been merely divorced and exiled, Anne would face a far more terrible fate. Charged with adultery, treason, and witchcraft, she was tried, condemned, and executed in a proceeding so legally dubious that even Henry's supporters were shocked by its brutality. Anne Boleyn's death on May 19, 1536, marked the point of no return for the Tudor curse. As her severed head was held aloft before the crowds gathered at the Tower of London, something fundamental shifted in the spiritual atmosphere surrounding the English throne. Henry had not merely killed an inconvenient wife. He had murdered a crowned and anointed queen, breaking oaths that had been sworn before God and man. The blood of queens, spilled in the pursuit of male heirs, would stain the Tudor dynasty until its extinction. The pattern was now established, and it would repeat with mechanical precision through Henry's remaining marriages. Jane Seymour, the third wife, finally produced the longed-for son, Edward, born in 1537, but died of complications from childbirth, leaving Henry with an heir whose health was so fragile that courtiers whispered he had been bought with his mother's life. And of Cleves, the fourth wife, was divorced after 6 months when Henry claimed he had been deceived about her appearance. But she at least survived the experience. Catherine Howard, the fifth wife and Anne Boleyn's cousin, followed her relative to the executioner's block in 1542, charged with adultery and treason in proceedings that were even more clearly fabricated than those that had condemned Anne. Only Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife, managed to outlive Henry, but even she came dangerously close to sharing the fate of her predecessors. Henry's paranoia had grown so extreme by the 1540s that he saw threats everywhere, including in his own wife's religious writings. Catherine survived only because Henry died in January 1547, before he could act on his suspicions that she was promoting Protestant heresy. But Henry's death did not end the Tudor curse. It only passed it on to the next generation, where it would manifest in forms even more terrible than the matrimonial bloodbath of Henry's reign. Edward VI, the son for whom Henry had sacrificed so much, ascended the throne at age 9 as the youngest king in English history. Physically frail and emotionally damaged by the violent chaos of his father's court, Edward was completely dominated by ambitious nobles who used the boy king as a puppet while they looted the crown's resources and persecuted Catholics with a fanaticism that exceeded even Henry's religious extremism. Edward's reign, though brief, established patterns of religious persecution and political instability that would define the Tudor curse for generations. The young king, indoctrinated with Protestant theology from early childhood, developed a pathological hatred of Catholicism that manifested in increasingly brutal suppression of the old faith. Monasteries were destroyed, priests were executed, and ordinary Catholics were subjected to tortures that would have made the Spanish Inquisition proud. But the curse that had claimed Edward's mother during his birth continued to feed on the Tudor bloodline. The boy king's health, never robust, began to deteriorate rapidly in his early teens. By 1553, it was clear that Edward was dying, probably from tuberculosis, though some court physicians suspected poison. As death approached, Edward was manipulated by his Protestant advisors into attempting to exclude his Catholic half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth from the succession, instead naming Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin, as his heir. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553, at age 15, having ruled for just 6 years. His death unleashed the succession crisis that his father had worked so desperately to prevent, plunging England into civil conflict as Catholic Mary fought Protestant Jane for the throne. The brief reign of Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, ended with her execution, making her another victim of the Tudor curse's insatiable hunger for royal blood. Mary Tudor's accession to the throne in 1553 should have marked a new beginning for the dynasty, but instead it inaugurated the darkest chapter in Tudor history. Determined to restore England to the Catholic faith and convinced that God was testing her resolve through the Protestant heretics who surrounded her, Mary embarked on a campaign of religious persecution that would earn her the title Bloody Mary and ensure that the Tudor name would be associated forever with the smell of burning flesh. The Marian persecutions began in 1555 and continued until Mary's death in 1558. Claiming the lives of nearly 300 Protestant martyrs who were burned alive for refusing to recant their faith. These executions were not military casualties or political expedients. They were religious murders, carried out in public with maximum ceremony to demonstrate Mary's commitment to Catholic orthodoxy. The smoke from these fires rose over England like incense offered to some dark god, and with each execution, the Tudor curse grew stronger. But Mary's greatest tragedy was not the blood she spilled in God's name. It was the children she never had. Like her father before her, Mary became obsessed with producing heirs, convinced that God would bless her persecution of heretics by granting her the sons who would continue her Catholic restoration. She married Philip II of Spain in 1554, a union that made England a client state of the Habsburg Empire, and spent her remaining years experiencing the phantom pregnancies that convinced her she was carrying the Catholic prince who would undo her father's religious revolution. Each false pregnancy was a fresh torment, each phantom kick in her swollen belly a mockery of her desperate prayers for children. Mary's physicians, too terrified to tell her the truth, encouraged her delusions, describing in detail the development of babies that existed only in the Queen's fevered imagination. When Mary finally died in 1558, childless and broken, she had become a figure of such tragic madness that even her enemies pitied the woman who had tried to burn England back to the Catholic faith. The accession of Elizabeth I in 1558 seemed to promise a new beginning for the Tudor dynasty. Young, intelligent, and politically astute, Elizabeth possessed all the qualities that had made her grandfather Henry VII such an effective ruler. She ended the religious persecutions, established a moderate Protestant settlement that satisfied most of her subjects, and skillfully navigated the complex diplomatic challenges posed by Catholic powers that sought to destroy her bastard regime. But Elizabeth carried within her the same curse that had destroyed her father, brother, and sister. The need for heirs that had driven Henry VIII to madness manifested in Elizabeth as its mirror image, a pathological refusal to marry and produce children that would ensure the Tudor succession. Whether this refusal was psychological damage caused by witnessing her father's matrimonial carnage, political calculation based on the dangers that marriage represented to a female ruler, or simply another manifestation of the Tudor curse, the result was the same. Elizabeth would be the last of her line. For 45 years, Elizabeth ruled England with a skill and dedication that made her reign one of the most glorious in English history. She defeated the Spanish Armada, supported the flowering of English literature and theater, and established England as a major European power. But beneath the public triumphs, the Tudor curse continued its inexorable work. Elizabeth's court was a hotbed of intrigue, conspiracy, and violence that claimed the lives of nobles, courtiers, and would-be suitors with regularity. The curse manifested most clearly in Elizabeth's treatment of potential rivals and threats. Mary, Queen of Scots, her Catholic cousin and rival claimant to the English throne, was held prisoner for 19 years before being executed in 1587. The Earl of Essex, once Elizabeth's favorite courtier and possibly her lover, was executed for treason in 1601 after mounting a failed rebellion against the Queen's authority. Dozens of other nobles, priests, and political prisoners met their deaths during Elizabeth's reign, victims of a paranoia that seemed to grow stronger as the Queen aged and the reality of her childlessness became undeniable. Elizabeth I died on March 24, 1603, at age 69, having ruled for 45 years without marrying or producing heirs. With her death, the Tudor dynasty that had once seemed destined to rule England forever simply ceased to exist. The throne passed to James VI of Scotland, son of the executed Mary Stuart, uniting the English and Scottish crowns under a new dynasty that would face its own struggles with the forces that had destroyed the Tudors. The Tudor curse had achieved its ultimate goal, the complete extinction of the bloodline it had pursued for nearly a century. For Tudor monarchs had sat on the English throne, and each had been destroyed by the same forces that had elevated their dynasty to power. Henry VIII's desperate hunger for male heirs had led him to break with Rome, murder 2 wives, and unleash religious conflicts that would rage for generations. Edward VI's brief reign had been marked by religious extremism and political instability that prepared the ground for future civil wars. Mary's bloody persecution of Protestants had stained the Tudor name with innocent blood and demonstrated the dangers of mixing religious conviction with royal power. Elizabeth's refusal to marry had ended the dynasty as surely as if she had been murdered in her bed. The curse that followed the Tudor bloodline was not supernatural. It was the inevitable consequence of absolute power wielded without wisdom, of human nature corrupted by the intoxicating belief that royal blood carried divine privileges. Each Tudor monarch had possessed the intelligence and capability to break the cycle of violence and madness that consumed their dynasty, but each had instead chosen to feed the curse through acts of brutality, betrayal, and spiritual pride that made their ultimate destruction not just predictable, but necessary. Chapter 2: The Romanov Apocalypse, when divine right met revolutionary rage. In the Winter Palace of St. Petersburg, where the aurora borealis painted the sky in blood-red sheets and the wind from the Baltic Sea carried whispers of revolution. The last act of the Romanov dynasty began not with gunfire or political manifestos, but with the hypnotic gaze of a Siberian peasant whose eyes seemed to hold the darkness of eternity itself. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin had arrived at the imperial court in 1905 as a supposed holy man, a starets whose mystical powers were said to be capable of healing the incurable and seeing into the future. But what Rasputin brought to the Romanov family was not salvation. It was the final ingredient in a curse that had been building for 3 centuries, waiting for the moment when it could consume the most powerful monarchy on earth. The Romanov dynasty had ruled Russia since 1613, rising from the chaos of the time of troubles to establish an autocratic system that made the Tsar not merely a political leader, but a living god whose authority derived directly from heaven itself. For nearly 300 years, this divine mandate had seemed unshakable. The Romanovs had transformed Russia from a collection of feudal principalities into a vast empire stretching from Poland to the Pacific Ocean, commanding resources and populations that dwarfed those of any other European power. But by the time Nicholas II ascended the throne in 1894, the foundations of Romanov power had already begun to crack. The Industrial Revolution that had enriched and empowered the middle classes of Western Europe had barely touched Russia, leaving the vast majority of the population trapped in medieval serfdom, while a tiny elite lived in unimaginable luxury. The gap between the imperial family's ostentatious wealth and the grinding poverty of ordinary Russians had grown so vast that it seemed to violate the natural order of creation itself. Nicholas II was, by all accounts, a decent and well-meaning man who genuinely loved his family and wanted to do his best for his subjects. But he was also fatally weak, a ruler who possessed neither the intelligence to understand the forces reshaping the modern world, nor the ruthlessness necessary to maintain autocratic power in an age of democratic revolution. Where his predecessors had ruled through a combination of fear and traditional legitimacy, Nicholas attempted to govern through personal charm and religious conviction, qualities that were utterly inadequate for the challenges facing the Russian Empire in the early 20th century. The curse that would destroy the Romanovs manifested first in the person of the Tsarevich Alexei, Nicholas's only son and heir to the throne. Born in 1904, Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevented his blood from clotting properly and made even minor injuries potentially fatal. The disease was a direct consequence of the Romanovs' marriage practices. Like the Habsburgs, they had intermarried with closely related European royal families for generations, concentrating genetic defects along with political alliances. Alexei's hemophilia was not merely a medical condition, it was a dynastic catastrophe that threatened the very foundation of Romanov rule. The Tsarevich's suffering was so intense and unpredictable that he could be reduced from a healthy, active child to a writhing, screaming invalid within hours of a seemingly minor bump or fall. These crises, which could last for days or weeks, left the royal family in a state of constant terror, never knowing when their son and heir might be struck down by his own blood. It was this medical nightmare that opened the door for Rasputin's influence over the imperial family. The Siberian peasant possessed some genuine ability to ease Alexei's suffering, whether through hypnosis, herbal remedies, or simple psychological manipulation. Historians still debate. But what mattered was that Rasputin could often stop the Tsarevich's hemorrhaging when court physicians had declared the case hopeless, making him seem like a miracle worker to the desperate parents. Alexandra, Nicholas's wife and Alexei's mother, became particularly dependent on Rasputin's services. A German princess who had converted to Russian Orthodoxy upon her marriage, Alexandra was already viewed with suspicion by many Russians who saw her as a foreign influence at court. Her obsessive devotion to the peasant mystic who could save her son only increased her isolation from Russian society and gave ammunition to her enemies who whispered that the Tsarina was under the control of a perverted charlatan. But Rasputin's influence extended far beyond the royal nursery. By 1910, he had become a power behind the throne, using his access to the imperial family to accumulate wealth, influence political appointments, and indulge in the kind of debauchery that scandalized even the corrupt society of St. Petersburg. Stories circulated throughout Russia about Rasputin's sexual excesses, his drunken rampages through fashionable restaurants, and his boasts that he controlled the Tsar and Tsarina through his mystical powers. These scandals might have remained mere gossip if Russia had been prosperous and stable, But by 1914, the empire was facing crises that threatened its very existence. The disastrous war with Japan in 1904 to 1905 had exposed the fundamental weakness of the Russian military and led to a revolution that nearly toppled the monarchy. The economic disruption caused by rapid industrialization had created massive social problems that the autocratic government seemed incapable of addressing. And throughout Russian society, new ideologies, socialism, anarchism, nationalism, were spreading like wildfire among populations that had lost faith in the traditional order. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 should have provided Nicholas II with an opportunity to rally his subjects around the throne and restore the monarchy's prestige through military victory. Instead, it became the catalyst that transformed the Romanov curse from a family tragedy into a national catastrophe. Russia's entry into the war was initially popular, with crowds cheering the Tsar's declaration and millions of soldiers marching off to battle convinced that they would be home by Christmas. But the Russian military machine, already weakened by corruption and incompetence, proved utterly inadequate for the demands of modern warfare. Within months, Russian armies were suffering catastrophic defeats on both the German and Austrian fronts, losing hundreds of thousands of men in battles that accomplished nothing except to demonstrate the regime's total inability to protect its people. By 1915, Russian casualties exceeded 2 million, and the country's economic system was collapsing under the strain of supporting a war effort that consumed resources faster than they could be produced. Nicholas's decision to take personal command of the Russian armies in 1915 was intended to restore confidence in the monarchy by demonstrating the Tsar's commitment to victory. Instead, it only ensured that he would be held personally responsible for every subsequent military disaster. While Nicholas was at the front, playing at being a soldier while his armies disintegrated around him, actual power in St. Petersburg fell into the hands of Alexander and Rasputin, whose influence over government appointments and policy decisions became the subject of increasingly vicious rumors. The whispers that circulated through Russian society during the war years would have destroyed any government, but they were particularly devastating for an autocracy that depended on mystical reverence for the ruler's person. Russians began to believe that their Tsarina was a German spy who was deliberately sabotaging the war effort, that Rasputin was her lover and co-conspirator, and that the imperial family had sold out Russia to its enemies. None of these rumors were true, but truth had become irrelevant in a country where reality was so unbearable that any explanation, however fantastic, seemed preferable to accepting that their government was simply incompetent. The murder of Rasputin on December 30, 1916, was organized by a group of aristocrats who believed that eliminating the peasant mystic would save the monarchy by removing the source of the scandals that were destroying its reputation. Prince Felix Yusupov, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, and their co-conspirators lured Rasputin to a basement room in Yusupov's palace, where they attempted to poison him with cyanide-laced cakes and wine. When the poison failed to work, Rasputin apparently had developed some immunity through years of attempting suicide with various toxins. They shot him multiple times, beat him with clubs, and finally threw his body into the frozen Neva River. But Rasputin's death only accelerated the Romanov dynasty's destruction. The murder eliminated the one person who might have been able to ease Alexei's suffering, leaving the imperial family without their most important psychological crutch at the moment when they needed it most. More significantly, it demonstrated that even members of the high nobility had lost faith in the monarchy and were willing to commit murder to try to save it from itself. The February Revolution of 1917 erupted with a suddenness that caught everyone by surprise, including the revolutionaries themselves. What began as bread riots in St. Petersburg quickly spread throughout the empire as military units joined the protesters and the entire apparatus of imperial government simply collapsed. Within a week, Nicholas II had been forced to abdicate, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule without a shot being fired in the dynasty's defense. The provisional government that replaced the Tsar attempted to continue Russia's participation in World War I while implementing democratic reforms, but this compromise satisfied no one and pleased no one. The war continued to drain resources and claim lives, while the promised reforms were delayed by the crisis atmosphere that pervaded the country. Meanwhile, more radical revolutionaries led by Vladimir Lenin were promising peace, land, and bread. Everything that ordinary Russians wanted and the provisional government seemed unable to deliver. The October Revolution that brought the Bolsheviks to power in 1917 was not the popular uprising of Marxist mythology. It was essentially a military coup carried out by a small group of professional revolutionaries who seized key points in St. Petersburg while most of the population was unaware that anything significant was happening. But the Bolsheviks' victory was consolidated by their willingness to give Russians what they wanted: an end to the war, redistribution of land to peasants, and bread for the hungry workers in the cities. The fate of the Romanov family was sealed from the moment Lenin's government consolidated power. As symbols of the old regime and potential rallying points for counter-revolutionary forces, Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children represented existential threats to Bolshevik rule that could not be tolerated. The decision to murder the entire family was made at the highest levels of the Communist Party and was carried out with the methodical brutality that would characterize Soviet rule for the next 70 years. The execution took place on the night of July 16 to 17, 1918, in the basement of the Ipatov house in Ekaterinburg, where the family had been held prisoner for several months. The Bolshevik executioners, led by Yakov Yurovsky, awakened the family in the early hours of July 17th and told them they were being moved to a safer location due to approaching White Army forces. Instead, they were led to the basement and shot down in a hail of gunfire that lasted several minutes. But even in death, the Romanov curse was not finished with its victims. The executioners had expected the family to die quickly, but several of the children survived the initial volley because they were wearing corsets lined with jewels that deflected the bullets. What followed was a scene of such horrific brutality that even the hardened Bolshevik killers were traumatized by their participation in it. The wounded children were finished off with bayonets and rifle butts in an orgy of violence that seemed to go on forever in the confined space of the basement. The bodies were then taken to a remote forest location, where they were mutilated beyond recognition, doused with acid to prevent identification, and buried in unmarked graves that would not be discovered for more than 70 years. The Bolsheviks were determined not merely to kill the Romanovs, but to erase them from history entirely, ensuring that no trace remained of the dynasty that had once seemed destined to rule Russia forever. The curse that had followed the Romanov bloodline for centuries achieved its ultimate goal with the massacre in Ekaterinburg. But like all curses, it was not supernatural. It was the inevitable consequence of a system of government that claimed divine sanction while serving only the interests of a tiny elite. The Romanovs had ruled Russia as if it were their personal property, treating their subjects as resources to be exploited rather than as human beings with rights and dignity. When the reckoning finally came, it was absolute and merciless, consuming not just the imperial family but the entire social order they had represented. Chapter 3. The Habsburg Nightmare when royal blood became poison. In the mirrored halls of Schönbrunn Palace, where chandeliers cast fractured rainbows across marble floors and the portraits of emperors gazed down with eyes that seemed to follow visitors through gilded corridors, the most terrible curse in European history reached its horrific climax in the person of Charles II of Spain, whose very existence was an affront to nature itself. Born on November 6, 1661, Charles was the final product of 2 centuries of systematic inbreeding, a genetic catastrophe so severe that modern medical experts struggle to understand how such a creature could have survived to adulthood, let alone ruled one of the world's greatest empires for 35 years. The Habsburg dynasty had risen to unprecedented heights through a marriage strategy that seemed blessed by heaven itself. Beginning with Rudolf I in the 13th century, the family had used strategic marriages to accumulate territories, titles, and crowns across Europe until they controlled an empire that stretched from Spain to Hungary, from the Netherlands to Naples. Their motto, Bella Gerunt Alii, Tu Felix Austria Nube, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, Mary, had proven so successful that by the 16th century, the sun never set on Habsburg dominions. But the very strategy that had made the Habsburgs the most powerful dynasty in European history also contained the seeds of their genetic destruction. In order to keep their vast holdings united and prevent the division of their inheritance among multiple heirs, the Habsburgs had developed an obsessive commitment to marrying within their own family. Uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins, and in some cases, the genetic relationships were so close that they violated both natural law and the teachings of the Catholic Church. The most visible manifestation of this genetic disaster was the famous Habsburg jaw, a severe underbite caused by mandibular prognathism that made normal speech and eating difficult or impossible. But the Habsburg jaw was merely the most obvious symptom of a genetic catastrophe that also included mental retardation, epilepsy, sterility, and immune system deficiencies that made family members susceptible to diseases that rarely affected normal populations. The curse had been building through generations of Habsburg marriages, growing stronger with each union between closely related family members. Emperor Charles V, the titan who had ruled half the known world in the 16th century, suffered from the Habsburg jaw, chronic digestive problems, and periods of depression so severe that he ultimately abdicated his throne and retired to a monastery to spend his final years in prayer and meditation. His son Philip II of Spain continued the pattern of close intermarriage, wedding his own niece Anna of Austria and producing children who displayed increasingly severe genetic abnormalities. But it was the marriage of Philip IV of Spain to his niece Mariana of Austria in 1649 that created the genetic perfect storm that would produce Charles II. Philip and Mariana were not merely uncle and niece. Their family trees were so intertwined that they shared more genetic material than typical siblings. The inbreeding coefficient of their union was higher than that found in most laboratory experiments designed to study the effects of extreme genetic isolation. The children born to Philip and Mariana were living testimonies to the consequences of genetic recklessness. Their daughter Maria Teresa died in infancy from convulsions. Their son Philip Prospero survived to age 4 but was described by court physicians as weak in mind and body, unable to walk or speak properly, and subject to fits of screaming that lasted for hours. When Philip Prospero died in 1661, the Spanish succession fell to Charles, the couple's youngest child and the most genetically damaged of all. Contemporary descriptions of Charles II paint a portrait of genetic abnormality so extreme that it defies modern medical understanding. His autopsy, performed after his death in 1700, revealed a body that seemed to have been assembled from spare parts by a mad scientist. His heart was described as the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded throughout. His intestines were putrefied and gangrenous, and he possessed a single testicle, black as coal. But it was Charles's appearance during his lifetime that provided the most shocking evidence of Habsburg genetic collapse. Multiple portraits and contemporary accounts describe a man whose lower jaw protruded so far beyond his upper jaw that he could not chew food properly and frequently drooled uncontrollably. His tongue was so large that it often hung out of his mouth, making coherent speech nearly impossible. His eyes were described as vacant and staring, as if he were looking at things that others could not see, while his hair was so thin and brittle that he was effectively bald by his 20th birthday. The psychological effects of extreme inbreeding were even more devastating than the physical deformities. Charles II never learned to read or write despite the efforts of a succession of tutors. He could not understand basic mathematical concepts, had no grasp of geography or history, and was incapable of following logical arguments or making rational decisions. Court records describe a king who would sometimes spend entire days staring at a single object, who required constant supervision to prevent him from injuring himself, and who lived in a fantasy world populated by imaginary enemies and supernatural threats. Most tragically of all, Charles II was completely sterile, making it impossible for him to produce heirs and continue the Spanish Habsburg line. His two marriages, first to Marie-Louise of Orleans and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg, were exercises in futility, as Charles was physically incapable of consummating either union. The Spanish court spent decades pretending that the king might still father children, subjecting his wives to humiliating medical examinations and public prayers for fertility while everyone involved knew that the situation was hopeless. The genetic catastrophe that was Charles II did not exist in isolation. It was merely the most extreme example of a pattern that was destroying Habsburg bloodlines throughout Europe. In Austria, Emperor Leopold I struggled with chronic health problems that included severe digestive issues, recurring skin infections, and periods of depression that lasted for months. His children with his first wife, Margaret Teresa of Spain, who was both his cousin and his niece, displayed classic signs of genetic abnormalities, including cleft palates, developmental delays, and susceptibility to diseases that proved fatal in several cases. The Austrian branch of the Habsburg family continued the pattern of close intermarriage through subsequent generations, with each union between related family members producing offspring who were increasingly frail and short-lived. Emperor Joseph I, Leopold's eldest son, died at age 32 from smallpox, but his weakened immune system had made him susceptible to diseases that rarely killed healthy adults. His brother Charles VI survived longer but was described by contemporary observers as sickly in both body and mind, while his daughter Maria Theresa, though more robust than many of her relatives, gave birth to 16 children, many of whom died in infancy or childhood. The genetic problems reached a crescendo in the 18th century with Emperor Joseph II, whose parents, Maria Theresa and Francis I, were descended from multiple Habsburg bloodlines that had been intermarrying for centuries. Joseph displayed many of the classic Habsburg genetic disorders, including the distinctive jaw deformity, chronic health problems, and psychological instability that manifested in increasingly erratic behavior as he aged. His rapid-fire implementation of hundreds of new laws and regulations, his frequent reversals of his own policies, and his inability to understand why his subjects resented constant change all suggest a mind that was brilliant but fundamentally unstable. The ultimate irony of the Habsburg genetic crisis was that it was completely avoidable. Contemporary medical knowledge, while primitive by modern standards, was sufficient to recognize that marriages between close relatives increased the risk of birth defects and hereditary diseases. Spanish and Austrian court physicians repeatedly warned Habsburg rulers about the dangers of continued intermarriage, citing examples from both human and animal breeding programs that demonstrated the consequences of excessive inbreeding. But these warnings were ignored in favor of short-term political considerations. Each generation of Habsburg rulers convinced themselves that their family's genetic problems were aberrations that could be overcome through willpower, religious devotion, or medical intervention. They refused to acknowledge that their marriage strategy was systematically destroying their own bloodlines, preferring to blame their children's deformities and early deaths on everything from divine punishment to witchcraft. The price paid for this genetic recklessness was enormous, not just in human suffering but in lost political opportunities and military defeats that might have been avoided if Habsburg rulers had possessed the physical and mental capacity to govern effectively. The Spanish Empire's gradual decline from the pinnacle of world power in the 16th century to a second-rate European state by the 18th century can be traced directly to the cumulative effects of genetic deterioration caused by centuries of systematic inbreeding. The War of the Spanish Succession, which erupted upon Charles II's death in 1700, was a direct consequence of the Habsburg genetic catastrophe. Because Charles was sterile, his death meant the extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line and opened a succession crisis that involved every major European power. The war that followed lasted 13 years, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and permanently altered the balance of power on the continent. All because a royal dynasty had been so obsessed with genetic purity that it had bred itself into extinction. The Austrian Habsburgs survived longer than their Spanish cousins, but they too were ultimately consumed by the genetic curse that had followed their bloodline for centuries. The dynasty's gradual decline from the height of power under Charles V to relative insignificance by the 19th century can be traced directly to the accumulating effects of inbreeding and the physical and mental deterioration it caused in successive generations of rulers. Modern genetic analysis of Habsburg remains has confirmed what contemporary observers could only suspect: that the family suffered from multiple hereditary disorders that were passed down and amplified through generation after generation of cousin marriages. The Habsburg jaw alone involved at least 15 different genetic factors, while other disorders included various forms of mental illness, autoimmune diseases, and developmental abnormalities that affected everything from bone formation to brain chemistry. The Habsburg story serves as perhaps the most dramatic example in human history of how the pursuit of political power, when divorced from biological reality, can lead to the destruction of the very dynasty it was intended to preserve. In their obsession with maintaining dynastic purity and political control, the Habsburgs created a genetic prison from which they could never escape, condemning generation after generation of their descendants to lives of pain, disability, and premature death. The curse that destroyed the Habsburgs was not supernatural. It was the inevitable consequence of treating human beings like livestock, of believing that political considerations could override the laws of biology, and of refusing to acknowledge that even royal blood must obey the same natural laws that govern all life on Earth. When the reckoning finally came, it was absolute and merciless, consuming not just individual rulers but entire branches of one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. Chapter 4. The Bourbon Apocalypse, when divine kings met the people's wrath. In the gilded halls of Versailles, where mirrors reflected not just the faces of courtiers but the accumulated sins of 3 centuries. The most magnificent palace in European history stood as a monument to royal excess that would ultimately become the tomb of a dynasty. The Palace of Versailles, with its 1,000 rooms, its gardens that stretched to the horizon, and its daily ceremonies that transformed the basic functions of human life into elaborate rituals of worship, represented the absolute pinnacle of monarchical power. But by 1789, this gleaming symbol of divine authority had become something far more sinister. A glittering prison where the last Bourbon kings of France lived in a fantasy world of their own creation while their kingdom collapsed into revolution and terror. The Bourbon dynasty had ruled France since 1589, when Henry IV converted from Protestantism to Catholicism with the pragmatic observation that Paris is worth a mass. For 2 centuries, the Bourbons had seemed blessed by heaven itself, transforming France from a war-torn collection of feudal territories into the most powerful and culturally influential nation in Europe. Under Louis XIV, the Sun King, French armies had marched across Europe while French culture, language, and fashion had become the standard of civilization throughout the Western world. But the very magnificence that had made the Bourbons the envy of European royalty also contained the seeds of their destruction. The palace at Versailles, begun by Louis XIV as a symbol of royal power, had gradually become a barrier that separated the monarchy from the French people. The elaborate court ceremonies that had once impressed foreign ambassadors with French grandeur had evolved into a rigid system of etiquette that consumed enormous resources while producing nothing of value. The nobles who had once served as advisors and administrators had become decorative courtiers whose primary function was to provide an audience for the king's daily rituals. By the reign of Louis XVI, who ascended the throne in 1774, the gap between the fantasy world of Versailles and the reality of French society had grown so wide that it seemed to exist in different universes. While courtiers debated the proper protocol for presenting the king with his morning shirt, French farmers were starving due to crop failures and economic disruption. While Marie Antoinette played at being a shepherdess in her artificial village, French workers were rioting in the streets of Paris over the price of bread. While the royal family spent fortunes on elaborate court entertainments, the French government was sliding toward bankruptcy due to the enormous costs of supporting the American Revolution. Louis XVI himself was a tragic figure, a fundamentally decent man who genuinely wanted to serve his people but was utterly unprepared for the challenges facing 18th-century monarchy. Trained from birth to believe that his authority derived directly from God and that questioning royal decisions was tantamount to blasphemy, Louis was incapable of understanding that the social and economic forces reshaping European society required fundamental changes in the way France was governed. His attempts at reform were always too little and too late, undermined by his own inability to comprehend that the old system of absolute monarchy was no longer viable in an age of democratic revolution. Marie Antoinette, the Austrian princess who had married Louis in 1770 as part of a diplomatic alliance between France and Austria, became the perfect symbol of everything the French people had come to hate about their monarchy. Beautiful, frivolous, and completely indifferent to the suffering of ordinary French citizens, Marie Antoinette embodied the callousness and extravagance that had made the Bourbon court a byword for royal decadence. Her legendary response to reports that the French people had no bread, "Let them eat cake," may have been apocryphal, but it captured perfectly the attitude of a queen who lived in such complete isolation from reality that she could not even imagine the lives of her subjects. The curse that had been building around the Bourbon dynasty for generations finally erupted in the summer of 1789, when financial crisis forced Louis XVI to convene the Estates General for the first time since 1614. What Louis intended as a consultation with his subjects about tax reform instead became the catalyst for a revolutionary explosion that would consume not just the monarchy, but the entire social order of the old regime. The Third Estate's transformation into the National Assembly, their tennis court oath to create a new constitution, and their declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen represented nothing less than a fundamental challenge to the divine right of kings that had been the foundation of Bourbon power. The initial phase of the French Revolution might have resulted in a constitutional monarchy similar to the system that had emerged in England after the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Many of the revolutionary leaders were not Republicans but moderate reformers who wanted to preserve the monarchy while limiting its powers and creating a more equitable society. Louis XVI himself seemed willing to accept constitutional limitations on his authority, and for a brief moment in 1791, it appeared that France might achieve peaceful transformation from absolute monarchy to limited government. But the Bourbon curse would not be satisfied with mere political reform. The discovery of Louis XVI's secret correspondence with foreign powers, his attempts to flee France in 1791, and his apparent willingness to invite foreign invasion to restore his absolute authority convinced many French revolutionaries that the monarchy could never be trusted to respect constitutional limits. The king who had once been revered as the father of his people was now seen as a traitor who was willing to sacrifice French independence to preserve his own privileges. The execution of Louis XVI on January 21, 1793, marked the point of no return for both the French Revolution and the Bourbon dynasty. The king's death was not merely a political act. It was a ritual sacrifice that symbolically destroyed the entire concept of divine monarchy. When Louis's severed head was held aloft before the crowds gathered in the Place de la Révolution, something fundamental shifted in the spiritual atmosphere of European civilization. The sacred bond between kings and subjects, which had been the foundation of political authority for more than 1,000 years, was broken forever. But the revolutionaries who celebrated Louis XVI's execution could not have imagined the horror that would follow. The reign of terror that consumed France from 1793 to 1794 was not merely a political purge. It was an orgy of violence that seemed to feed on itself, growing more extreme and irrational with each passing month. The guillotine, that symbol of revolutionary justice, became an insatiable monster that devoured not just aristocrats and royalists, but eventually the revolutionaries themselves. Marie Antoinette's execution on October 16, 1793, was the culmination of a campaign of character assassination that had transformed the Austrian princess from a figure of frivolous excess into a symbol of absolute evil. The charges against her, treason, corruption, sexual perversion, even incest with her young son, were largely fabricated, but they served their purpose of justifying her destruction. The queen who had once played at being a shepherdess in her artificial village met her death with a courage and dignity that impressed even her enemies, walking to the scaffold with her head held high and her prayers on her lips. The deaths of the king and queen might have satisfied the revolutionary hunger for royal blood, but the Bourbon curse demanded more complete destruction. The couple's young son, Louis Charles, who would have been Louis XVII if the monarchy had survived, was subjected to treatment so cruel that it shocked even hardened revolutionaries. Separated from his parents and placed in the care of a cobbler named Antoine Simon, the 8-year-old boy was systematically brutalized, neglected, and probably sexually abused in an apparent attempt to break his spirit and prevent him from becoming a rallying point for royalist resistance. Louis Charles died in the Temple prison on June 8, 1795, at the age of 10, officially from tuberculosis but probably from a combination of neglect, abuse, and despair. His death marked the extinction of the direct Bourbon line and the completion of the revolutionary project to erase the monarchy from French history. The boy who should have inherited the throne of France instead became another victim of the curse that had consumed his dynasty. His short life a testament to the revolutionary principle that royal blood conferred no protection from popular vengeance. The surviving members of the Bourbon family, those who had managed to escape France during the early years of the Revolution, spent the next quarter-century in exile, watching from foreign courts as their homeland was transformed by forces they could neither understand nor control. The restoration of the monarchy in 1814, following Napoleon's defeat, might have seemed like the end of the Bourbon curse, but it was actually only a temporary reprieve in a story that was far from over. Louis XVIII, who became king after Napoleon's abdication, was an intelligent and pragmatic ruler who understood that the old regime could never be fully restored. His reign was marked by an attempt to reconcile the principles of the revolution with the traditions of monarchy, creating a constitutional system that preserved the forms of royal authority while acknowledging the political realities created by 25 years of revolutionary change. But Louis XVIII was childless, and his death in 1824 brought to the throne his brother Charles X, who was determined to restore absolute monarchy and undo the compromises that had made the Bourbon restoration possible. Charles X's reign was a masterpiece of political stupidity that demonstrated how the Bourbon curse could manifest itself through sheer obtuseness as well as dramatic tragedy. Convinced that the French people were secretly longing for a return to the old regime, Charles attempted to restore the power and privileges of the Catholic Church, compensate nobles for property lost during the Revolution, and reimpose the kind of absolute authority that had existed before 1789. These policies united virtually every segment of French society in opposition to his rule and made another revolution inevitable. The July Revolution of 1830 was the final act in the destruction of the senior Bourbon line. When Charles X issued the July Ordinances, which dissolved the Chamber of Deputies, restricted press freedom, and altered the electoral system to benefit his supporters, the people of Paris rose in rebellion for the third time in 40 years. But unlike the Revolution of 1789, which had been driven by economic crisis and social grievance, the Revolution of 1830 was a purely political uprising aimed at removing a king who had violated the constitutional compact that made his rule legitimate. Charles X's abdication and flight to England marked the end of the senior Bourbon line's rule in France, though junior branches of the family would continue to claim the French throne for generations to come. The curse that had begun with the execution of Louis XVI had achieved its ultimate goal: the permanent exclusion of the Bourbon dynasty from power in the country they had ruled for more than 2 centuries. Chapter 5: The Stuart Catastrophe when Divine Right Collided with Parliamentary Power. In the cold stone chambers of Whitehall Palace, where the wind from the Thames carried the scent of approaching winter and the sound of hammering as carpenters constructed a scaffold outside the banqueting house, King Charles I of England spent his final night on earth writing letters to his children and preparing his soul for a death that would echo through the centuries. January 30th, 1649, dawned gray and bitter, but the crowd that gathered to witness the execution of England's king was warm with righteous fury and revolutionary fervor. When the masked executioner raised his axe and brought it down on the royal neck, he was not merely ending a single life. He was delivering the death blow to a dynasty that had believed itself chosen by God to rule over men. The Stuart dynasty had come to the English throne in 1603 with the death of Elizabeth I and the accession of James VI of Scotland as James I of England. The union of the English and Scottish crowns should have inaugurated an era of peace and prosperity, but instead it planted the seeds of conflicts that would ultimately destroy the Stuart line and transform the very nature of monarchy itself. James I brought with him from Scotland a theory of kingship that was fundamentally incompatible with the English political tradition, the doctrine of the divine right of kings, which held that monarchs derived their authority directly from God and were accountable to no earthly power. This collision between absolutist theory and constitutional practice created tensions that would build through successive reigns until they exploded in civil war, regicide, and revolution. James I himself managed to avoid the worst consequences of this conflict through a combination of political skill, personal charisma, and sheer luck. But his son Charles I possessed none of his father's political acumen and all of his father's theoretical commitment to absolute monarchy, creating a perfect storm of constitutional crisis that would ultimately destroy both king and kingdom. Charles I ascended the throne in 1625 convinced that he was God's anointed representative on earth, accountable only to the Almighty for his actions and decisions. This conviction was not merely a political theory. It was a religious faith that shaped every aspect of Charles's approach to governance. He genuinely believed that opposition to his will was tantamount to blasphemy, that Parliament existed only to approve his decisions and provide him with money, and that any attempt to limit his power was an attack on the divine order of creation itself. The curse that would destroy the Stuart dynasty manifested first in Charles's inability to understand that political authority in 17th-century England required consensus and cooperation rather than divine mandate. His attempts to rule without Parliament, his imposition of unpopular religious policies, and his apparent willingness to use foreign troops against his own subjects convinced many English people that their king was not divinely appointed but diabolically inspired. The crisis began in earnest in 1640, when Charles's financial needs forced him to recall Parliament after 11 years of personal rule. The MPs who assembled at Westminster were not the compliant assembly that Charles expected, but a collection of men who had spent more than a decade watching their king violate English law, tradition, and religious settlement. They came to Parliament not to rubber-stamp royal policies, but to redress grievances that had been accumulating for nearly 2 decades. The Long Parliament, as it came to be known, quickly moved beyond mere criticism of royal policies to fundamental questioning of the nature of royal authority itself. The execution of the Earl of Strafford, Charles's chief minister, in 1641 was not merely the elimination of an unpopular advisor. It was a direct challenge to the king's right to choose his own counselors and pursue his own policies. When Charles attempted to arrest 5 members of Parliament for treason in 1642, he crossed a line that made armed conflict inevitable. The English Civil War that erupted in 1642 was not merely a political struggle between king and parliament. It was a theological conflict about the very nature of political authority. Charles's supporters, known as Cavaliers or Royalists, fought for the principle that kings ruled by divine right and that rebellion against royal authority was both treason and sin. Parliament's supporters, known as Roundheads, fought for the principle that political authority derived from the consent of the governed and that kings who violated the law could legitimately be resisted. The war that followed was brutal and destructive, tearing apart the fabric of English society and turning neighbor against neighbor, father against son, brother against brother. Contemporary estimates suggest that the conflict claimed the lives of more than 200,000 people, a higher percentage of the English population than would die in either World War I or World War II. The curse that followed the Stuart bloodline had transformed a political dispute into a national catastrophe that scarred English society for generations. Charles I's defeat and capture in 1647 should have led to a negotiated settlement that preserved the monarchy while limiting its powers. Many parliamentary leaders, including Oliver Cromwell, initially hoped to find a constitutional solution that would allow Charles to remain king while accepting meaningful constraints on his authority. But Charles's refusal to accept any genuine limitations on his power, combined with his secret negotiations with Scottish and Irish forces to restore his absolute authority, convinced his captors that he could never be trusted to respect constitutional government. The trial of Charles I in January 1649 was one of the most momentous events in European history, representing the first time that a reigning monarch had been formally charged with crimes against his own subjects. The court that tried Charles was legally dubious. It had been established by Parliament after the House of Lords had refused to participate and represented only a fraction of the Commons. But the charges against the king were serious and specific: that he had waged war against his own people, that he had violated the fundamental laws of the kingdom, and that he was a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and a public and implacable enemy to the Commonwealth of England. Charles's behavior during his trial revealed both the nobility and the fatal blindness that had characterized his entire reign. He conducted himself with dignity and courage, refusing to recognize the authority of the court while maintaining his innocence of all charges. But he also demonstrated the same inflexibility and unwillingness to compromise that had made civil war inevitable. Even faced with death, Charles could not acknowledge that his conception of monarchy was fundamentally incompatible with English political traditions. The execution of Charles I on January 30, 1649, was witnessed by thousands of spectators who gathered in Whitehall to see their king die. Contemporary accounts describe a crowd that was initially hostile to Charles but was impressed by his composure and dignity in his final moments. The king's last words, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown," revealed a man who remained convinced to the end that his earthly sufferings were merely a prelude to heavenly reward. But Charles's death did not end the Stuart curse. It only transformed it. The Commonwealth that replaced the monarchy was supposed to demonstrate that England could prosper without kings, but instead it proved that republicanism was no more capable of solving the fundamental problems of governance than absolute monarchy had been. Oliver Cromwell's protectorate became increasingly dictatorial and unpopular, while the costs of maintaining large armies and suppressing royalist resistance drained the country's resources and exhausted its patience with republican government. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 brought Charles II, the executed king's eldest son, to the throne amid scenes of popular celebration that seemed to suggest that the Stuart curse had been broken. Charles II was everything his father had not been: pragmatic, flexible, and willing to work with Parliament to achieve his goals. His reign was marked by economic prosperity, scientific advancement, and cultural achievement that made Restoration England one of the most dynamic societies in Europe. But the curse that had destroyed Charles I was not finished with the Stuart bloodline. Charles II's reign was also marked by religious conflict, political conspiracy, and the constant threat of civil war that reminded contemporaries that the fundamental issues that had caused the First Civil War remained unresolved. The king's Catholicism, his secret alliance with Louis XIV of France, and his apparent willingness to rule as an absolute monarch created tensions that would ultimately destroy his brother's reign and drive the Stuart dynasty from the throne forever. James II's accession in 1685 represented the fulfillment of Protestant England's worst nightmares about Stuart rule. James was not merely a Catholic. He was a militant Catholic who was determined to restore England to the Roman faith and establish the kind of absolute monarchy that his brother had wisely avoided. His reign was marked by a systematic campaign to place Catholics in positions of power, override parliamentary legislation through royal prerogative, and create a standing army that could be used to suppress Protestant resistance. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 was the final act in the destruction of the Stuart dynasty. When James II's son was born in June 1688, creating the prospect of a perpetual Catholic dynasty, Protestant leaders issued an invitation to William of Orange, James's Protestant son-in-law, to invade England and claim the throne. William's invasion succeeded without significant resistance, as James's support collapsed with stunning rapidity. The king who had once commanded the most powerful military forces in English history found himself abandoned by his army, his nobility, and even his own family. James II's flight to France in December 1688 marked the end of Stuart rule in England, though the dynasty would continue to claim the throne for generations to come. The Jacobite cause, which sought to restore the Stuart line through James II's descendants, would inspire romantic devotion and bloody rebellion for the next 60 years, but it was ultimately doomed by the same inflexibility and inability to compromise that had destroyed the dynasty in the first place. The curse that followed the Stuart bloodline was the inevitable consequence of their refusal to adapt to changing political realities. From James I's assertion of divine right to James II's attempt to impose Catholicism on a Protestant nation, the Stuarts consistently chose ideological purity over political pragmatism, theoretical correctness over practical governance. Their destruction was not the result of external enemies or supernatural forces, but of their own inability to understand that successful monarchy in the modern world required consent, compromise, and constitutional limitation. Chapter 6. The Valois Extinction when the Hundred Years' War consumed a dynasty. In the torchlit halls of the Louvre, where the fleur-de-lis gleamed from every tapestry and the ghostly echoes of long-dead kings seemed to whisper warnings through stone corridors, the Valois dynasty of France faced a crisis that would test the very foundations of medieval monarchy. The year was 1328, and the death of Charles IV without male heirs had triggered a succession dispute that would plunge Western Europe into more than a century of warfare, devastation, and dynastic destruction. The House of Valois, which ascended to the French throne through the legal fiction of Salic law, would spend the next 260 years fighting for legitimacy, battling foreign invaders, and ultimately succumbing to the same forces of violence and political instability that had brought them to power. The Valois curse began not with supernatural intervention but with the fundamental weakness of their claim to the French throne. When the direct Capetian line ended with Charles IV in 1328, the succession should have passed to Edward III of England, who was Charles's nephew through his mother Isabella. But the French nobility, unwilling to accept an English king, invoked the ancient Salic law, which prohibited inheritance through the female line, to place Philip VI of Valois on the throne instead. This legal manipulation solved the immediate problem of English rule but created a far more dangerous long-term crisis by giving Edward III and his successors a permanent justification for war against France. Philip VI himself was a capable ruler who might have established the Valois dynasty on a secure foundation if he had been allowed to focus on domestic governance. But the English challenge to his legitimacy made war inevitable, and war was the one thing that medieval monarchy was least equipped to handle successfully. The feudal system that had sustained French power for centuries was already breaking down under the pressure of economic change and social transformation, while new military technologies were making traditional cavalry charges obsolete and empowering common soldiers at the expense of noble warriors. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 marked the beginning of the end for medieval French military supremacy and the start of a series of disasters that would plague the Valois dynasty for generations. Edward III's army, composed largely of English longbowmen and Welsh infantry, destroyed a French force that was larger, better equipped, and commanded by the flower of French nobility. The slaughter was so complete that chroniclers struggled to find words to describe it, while the political implications were even more devastating than the military casualties. Crécy demonstrated that the French claim to military superiority was a fantasy, that English forces could not only invade France but defeat French armies on French soil with apparent ease. More importantly, it revealed that the feudal system that formed the foundation of Valois power was fundamentally inadequate for the demands of 14th-century warfare. The French nobles who died at Crécy were not merely individual casualties. They were the pillars of a social system that had sustained French monarchy for centuries. The disaster at Crécy was followed 10 years later by an even more devastating defeat at Poitiers, where King John II himself was captured by the English and held for ransom. The spectacle of a French king in English captivity was a humiliation that shook the foundations of Valois legitimacy and demonstrated to all of Europe that French power was more appearance than reality. John's captivity also created a power vacuum in France that led to peasant rebellions, noble conspiracies, and the emergence of independent local authorities that challenged royal control throughout the kingdom. The Jacquerie of 1358, a massive peasant uprising that devastated the French countryside, was a direct consequence of the military disasters that had weakened Valois authority. The rebels, driven to desperation by the economic disruption caused by constant warfare, attacked noble estates, burned castles, and murdered aristocrats with a ferocity that shocked contemporary observers. Though the rebellion was eventually suppressed, it demonstrated that the social contract between rulers and ruled had been broken by the dynasty's military failures. But the curse that followed the Valois bloodline was not content with military defeat and social rebellion. It demanded more personal and intimate destruction. Charles V, who became king in 1364, was an intelligent and capable ruler who managed to reverse many of his predecessors' defeats and restore French military fortunes. But his reign was marked by the mysterious deaths of several potential heirs, including his eldest son, who died in infancy under circumstances that aroused suspicions of poison. When Charles himself died in 1380, he left the throne to his 12-year-old son Charles VI, whose minority opened the door to the factional conflicts that would tear France apart for the next generation. Charles VI's reign became synonymous with madness, both literal and metaphorical, as the young king's mental illness coincided with the complete breakdown of French political unity. Charles's first attack of insanity occurred in 1392, when he suddenly turned on his own retinue during a military expedition and began attacking his companions with his sword, claiming that he was surrounded by enemies and traitors. From that point forward, Charles alternated between periods of lucidity and episodes of complete mental collapse that left him unable to recognize his own family or understand his surroundings. The king's madness created a power vacuum that was filled by competing factions led by his brother Louis, Duke of Orleans, and his cousin John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. The rivalry between these two princes escalated into open warfare that devastated France and made the country vulnerable to renewed English invasion. The assassination of Louis of Orleans in 1407, ordered by John the Fearless, marked the beginning of a civil war that would rage for decades and consume entire generations of French nobility. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 was the inevitable result of French political fragmentation and military incompetence. Henry V of England invaded France with a relatively small army, but found the French forces so disorganized and poorly commanded that he was able to achieve a victory even more complete than those won by his great-grandfather at Crécy and Poitiers. The French casualties at Agincourt included much of the remaining high nobility, while the political consequences of the defeat led directly to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which recognized Henry V as the heir to the French throne and effectively disinherited the Valois dynasty. The nadir of Valois fortunes came with the reign of Charles VII, who was mockingly called the King of Bourges because his authority was limited to a small area around that city while the English and their Burgundian allies controlled most of France, including Paris. Charles's legitimacy was questioned even by his own supporters, as rumors circulated that he was not actually the son of Charles VI, but the bastard offspring of one of his mother's many lovers. These doubts about his parentage, combined with his military failures and the loss of most of his kingdom, made Charles VII seem like a king in name only. The intervention of Joan of Arc in 1429 marked the beginning of the French recovery, but it also demonstrated how completely the Valois dynasty had failed in its most basic responsibility, the defense of the realm. The fact that it took a peasant girl claiming divine inspiration to rally French resistance to the English invasion was a devastating indictment of royal leadership and noble competence. Joan's victories at Orleans and elsewhere proved that the English could be defeated, but they also highlighted how utterly the traditional military and political elite had failed their country. Joan's capture and execution by the English in 1431 was a tragedy that resonated throughout France and Europe, but it was also a symbol of the curse that seemed to follow anyone who tried to save the Valois dynasty. The girl who had restored French military fortunes and enabled Charles VII's coronation was abandoned by the king she had served and allowed to burn at the stake while Charles made no serious effort to secure her release or ransom. The final century of Valois rule was marked by internal wars, foreign invasions, and religious conflicts that demonstrated the dynasty's complete inability to provide stable governance for France. The Italian wars that began in the 1490s drained French resources and led to military disasters that rivaled those of the Hundred Years' War. The wars of religion that erupted in the 1560s turned France into a battlefield where Catholic fought Protestant while foreign powers intervened to support their religious allies. The assassination of Henry III in 1589 by a fanatical monk marked the extinction of the Valois dynasty and the end of nearly 3 centuries of rule that had been characterized by almost constant warfare, political instability, and dynastic weakness. The curse that had followed the Valois bloodline from the moment they usurped the throne in 1328 had finally achieved its ultimate goal: the complete destruction of a royal house that had never been able to establish legitimate authority or provide effective governance for the kingdom it claimed to rule. The legacy of the Valois dynasty was not the glorious expansion of French power or the establishment of effective royal authority, but rather the demonstration that political legitimacy cannot be sustained through legal fiction and military force alone. Their reign was a testament to the proposition that royal authority must be earned through competent governance and popular consent, not simply claimed through hereditary right or imposed through violent conquest. When the final reckoning came, the Valois curse was revealed to be nothing more than the inevitable consequence of a dynasty that had never deserved the throne it had seized and never learned how to rule the kingdom it had inherited. Chapter 7. The Ptolemaic Nightmare When Gods Became Mortals in the Shadow of Rome. In the perfumed chambers of the great palace of Alexandria, where the ghosts of 3 centuries of god-kings wandered through corridors lined with gold and ivory, the last pharaoh of Egypt prepared for a death that would echo through eternity. Cleopatra VII, descendant of Alexander's general Ptolemy and heir to a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, stood in her private sanctuary as the Roman legions of Octavian closed in around her capital. The asp that would deliver her final kiss lay coiled in a basket of figs, its venom promising a death that was both divine and defiant. A fitting end for a woman who had embodied all the glory and corruption of the most incestuous royal bloodline in human history. The Ptolemaic dynasty had begun in glory when Ptolemy Isoter, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals, claimed Egypt as his portion of the divided Macedonian Empire in 323 BCE. Unlike the other successor kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's conquests, Egypt under the Ptolemies became a unique fusion of Greek sophistication and Egyptian mysticism, where pharaohs ruled as living gods while patronizing the greatest library and museum in the ancient world. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies had presided over the intellectual and cultural center of the Mediterranean, making Alexandria synonymous with learning, luxury, and power. But the very isolation that had protected Egypt from the chaos that consumed the other Hellenistic kingdoms also planted the seeds of the dynasty's ultimate destruction. The Ptolemies had adopted the ancient Egyptian practice of brother-sister marriage, believing that this would preserve the divine blood of the pharaohs while preventing the kingdom from being divided among multiple heirs. What they created instead was a genetic and political nightmare that grew more twisted with each generation, as rulers who were simultaneously siblings, spouses, and cousins produced offspring whose claims to divinity were matched only by their susceptibility to madness, disease, and moral corruption. The practice of sibling marriage that defined Ptolemaic rule was not merely a political strategy. It was a theological statement that the royal family existed outside the normal boundaries of human society and natural law. Each generation of Ptolemaic rulers was more closely related than the last, creating a genetic concentration that manifested in physical deformities, mental illness, and a level of family dysfunction that made the court of Alexandria notorious throughout the ancient world. Brothers murdered sisters, mothers poisoned sons, and children betrayed parents in an endless cycle of violence that was justified by the doctrine that gods were not bound by human morality. The curse that would ultimately destroy the Ptolemies manifested most clearly in their inability to maintain political unity even within their own family. The civil wars that ravaged Egypt during the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE were not conflicts between competing dynasties or foreign invaders, but fratricidal struggles between members of the same incestuous bloodline who viewed each other as obstacles to absolute power. These internal conflicts weakened Egypt at precisely the moment when Roman power was expanding throughout the Mediterranean, making the kingdom vulnerable to external manipulation and eventual conquest. Ptolemy VIII, known as Physcon, Potbelly, exemplified the moral and physical degeneration that was consuming the dynasty. Grossly obese, sexually perverted, and pathologically suspicious of his own family members, Physcon murdered his nephew, married his sister, drove his wife into exile, and then married his niece in a display of depravity that shocked even his contemporaries. His reign was marked by constant civil war, economic collapse, and the exodus of scholars and intellectuals who could no longer tolerate the violence and instability that had consumed their once great kingdom. The pattern of incest, murder, and civil war that characterized the later Ptolemaic period created a political environment in which effective governance became impossible. Each ruler was simultaneously fighting external enemies and internal rivals, making it impossible to develop coherent policies or maintain stable alliances. The Egyptian economy, once the wonder of the ancient world, stagnated under the burden of constant warfare and the incompetence of rulers whose genetic heritage had left them increasingly unfit for the demands of leadership. By the time Cleopatra VII ascended to the throne in 51 BCE, the Ptolemaic kingdom was already a shadow of its former greatness. Egypt remained wealthy and culturally significant, but its political independence was entirely dependent on Roman tolerance and protection. The young queen who would become history's most famous pharaoh inherited a kingdom that was simultaneously the oldest and the most fragile monarchy in the Mediterranean world, a dynasty whose divine pretensions could no longer conceal the reality of its genetic and political bankruptcy. Cleopatra herself represented both the culmination and the final expression of Ptolemaic ambition. Highly intelligent, culturally sophisticated, and politically astute, she possessed all the qualities that had made her dynasty great during its golden age. But she also carried within her bloodline the accumulated genetic damage of 3 centuries of inbreeding, manifesting in the physical and psychological instability that would ultimately contribute to her destruction. Contemporary accounts describe a woman of extraordinary charisma and sexual magnetism, but also one prone to violent mood swings, paranoid delusions, and the kind of grandiose fantasies that had characterized her ancestors. The queen's famous relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not merely romantic liaisons but desperate political gambits designed to preserve Egyptian independence through alliance with Roman strongmen. Cleopatra understood that Egypt could not survive as an independent kingdom without Roman protection, but she also believed that she could manipulate Roman politics to maintain Ptolemaic rule. Her seduction of Caesar and later Antony represented the last attempt by the Ptolemaic dynasty to maintain its divine status through sexual and political manipulation. But the curse that had followed the Ptolemaic bloodline for 3 centuries would not be denied by political cunning or erotic charm. Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE left Cleopatra vulnerable to his enemies, while her alliance with Antony ultimately aligned her with the losing side in the Roman Civil War that determined the fate of the Mediterranean world. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE was not merely a naval engagement but the final judgment on 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule, as Octavian's victory ensured that Egypt would become a Roman province rather than an independent kingdom. The year between Actium and Cleopatra's death was a prolonged agony that demonstrated the complete bankruptcy of Ptolemaic pretensions to divine authority. The queen who had once claimed to be the reincarnation of Isis found herself reduced to begging for mercy from Octavian, offering him her treasures, her body, and even her children in exchange for some form of continued existence. But Octavian, who understood the symbolic importance of completely eliminating the Ptolemaic line, was determined that Cleopatra's death would mark the definitive end of Hellenistic monarchy and the beginning of Roman imperial dominance. Cleopatra's suicide on August 30, 30 BCE, was carefully choreographed to preserve some dignity in defeat while denying Octavian the pleasure of parading her through Rome as a captive. The ASP that delivered the fatal bite was not merely a convenient means of death, but a symbol of the pharaonic authority that Cleopatra claimed until her final breath. In Egyptian mythology, the cobra was associated with divine protection and royal power, making Cleopatra's death both a surrender to Roman authority and a final assertion of her divine status. But even in death, the Ptolemaic curse was not finished with its victims. Caesar Ion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, was murdered on Octavian's orders despite being barely 17 years old. The boy's only crime was carrying Ptolemaic blood and representing a potential challenge to Roman authority, but his execution demonstrated that the new imperial system could tolerate no rivals, however young or powerless. Cleopatra's other children were spared but taken to Rome as captives, where they were displayed in Octavian's triumph before disappearing into obscurity. The extinction of the Ptolemaic dynasty marked the end of the last independent Hellenistic kingdom and the completion of Rome's conquest of the Mediterranean world. But it also represented something more profound: the failure of a political and genetic experiment that had attempted to create a race of god-kings through systematic inbreeding and autocratic rule. The Ptolemies had believed that divine blood could transcend the limitations of human nature, but their history demonstrated instead that even gods must obey the laws of genetics, politics, and historical change. The curse that destroyed the Ptolemies was not supernatural vengeance, but the inevitable consequence of believing that political authority could be maintained through mystical claims rather than effective governance. Their practice of sibling marriage, designed to preserve divine blood, instead created a genetic catastrophe that left later rulers increasingly unfit for leadership. Their isolation from Egyptian society, intended to maintain their status as living gods, instead made them incapable of understanding or responding to the political forces that were reshaping the ancient world. Chapter 8. The Macedonian Dissolution, when Alexander's death shattered the world. In the sweltering heat of Babylon, where the Euphrates River ran red with the reflected flames of funeral pyres and the air itself seemed thick with the weight of empire, the greatest conqueror in human history lay dying in a palace that had once belonged to the kings he had destroyed. Alexander III of Macedon, known to history as Alexander the Great, had spent 13 years conquering the known world, but in June 323 BCE, at the age of 32, he found himself facing an enemy that could not be defeated by military genius or personal courage. Death had come for the man who believed himself to be the son of Zeus, and with it came the dissolution of the largest empire the world had ever seen and the extinction of the Macedonian royal house that had dreamed of ruling the world forever. The Argead dynasty of Macedon had risen from obscurity to world dominance in less than a century, transforming a backward kingdom on the periphery of the Greek world into the master of an empire that stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River. Under Philip II, Alexander's father, Macedon had conquered Greece and laid the foundations for the campaign against Persia that would make his son immortal. But the very speed and scope of Macedonian expansion contained the seeds of its own destruction, creating political and military challenges that no single ruler, however gifted, could hope to resolve. Alexander's conquests had been achieved through a combination of military genius, personal charisma, and the kind of ruthless ambition that brooked no opposition and recognized no limits. In 13 years of continuous campaigning, he had defeated every army sent against him, captured every city that resisted him, and imposed Macedonian rule on populations that had never heard of his homeland. But conquest and governance are different arts, and Alexander's genius lay entirely in the former, while his understanding of the latter remained tragically limited. The curse that would destroy the Macedonian dynasty was already manifest in Alexander's character and behavior during his lifetime. His increasing megalomania, his adoption of Persian customs and religious practices, and his demand that his followers worship him as a god demonstrated a growing disconnect from reality that alarmed even his closest supporters. The murder of Clitus the Black, one of his oldest friends and most trusted generals, during a drunken quarrel in 328 BCE revealed the extent to which power had corrupted Alexander's judgment and isolated him from the human relationships that had once grounded his ambition. More ominously, Alexander's treatment of potential rivals within his own family demonstrated the paranoid suspicion that would ultimately doom the Macedonian succession. His execution of his cousin Amyntas IV, who had been king of Macedon before Philip II's usurpation, eliminated a potential claimant to the throne, but also established a precedent for solving dynastic disputes through murder rather than negotiation. The mysterious death of Alexander's half-brother Philip III Aridaeus, who was mentally disabled and therefore no real threat to anyone, suggested that Alexander's supporters were prepared to eliminate even harmless relatives to prevent succession disputes. But the most critical failure of Alexander's reign was his complete inability to plan for his own succession or prepare his empire for governance without his personal leadership. Despite ruling for 13 years and facing multiple near-death experiences during his campaigns, Alexander never designated an heir, never established institutions that could function in his absence, and never trained subordinates who could take over if he died unexpectedly. His empire was entirely dependent on his personal authority and military genius, making it inherently unstable and vulnerable to collapse the moment he was no longer available to hold it together. The circumstances of Alexander's death in Babylon remain one of history's great mysteries, with theories ranging from malaria and typhoid fever to poison administered by Macedonian nobles who had grown tired of his increasingly erratic behavior. What is certain is that his final illness lasted 11 days, during which he was lucid enough to conduct business and receive visitors but too weak to leave his bed or speak clearly. Contemporary accounts describe a gradual decline marked by fever, weakness, and difficulty breathing, but they also note that Alexander remained mentally alert until the very end, suggesting that his death was caused by disease rather than injury or poison. The question of succession became critical as Alexander's condition worsened, but the dying king's responses to inquiries about his heir were characteristically ambiguous and unhelpful. When asked to whom he left his kingdom, Alexander supposedly replied, "To the strongest," while his final act was to remove his signet ring and give it to Perdiccas, one of his bodyguards, without specifying whether this meant that Perdiccas was to serve as regent or assume royal authority. These ambiguous gestures, rather than providing clarity about the succession, instead created the political vacuum that would destroy both the empire and the dynasty within a generation. Alexander's death unleashed immediate chaos as his generals, known to history as the Diadochi or successors, began maneuvering for control of different portions of the empire. The initial settlement, negotiated during the partition of Babylon in 323 BCE, attempted to preserve the fiction of Macedonian unity by recognizing Alexander's mentally disabled half-brother Philip III Aridaeus as king and his infant son Alexander IV as heir, while dividing actual power among the various generals who would govern as satraps or regional commanders. But this compromise satisfied no one and pleased no one, as each of the successors understood that the empire was too large and diverse to be governed effectively by a single authority and too wealthy and powerful for any of them to be content with a subordinate role. Within months of Alexander's death, the successors were engaged in the first of what would become 40 years of continuous warfare as they fought for control of the Macedonian inheritance. The wars of the successors were not merely military conflicts but a systematic destruction of everything that Alexander had created. The cities he had founded were abandoned or destroyed, the populations he had tried to Hellenize were slaughtered or scattered, and the administrative systems he had established were dismantled by generals who cared more about immediate tactical advantage than long-term governance. The empire that had taken 13 years to conquer was torn apart in less than 5, leaving behind only fragments that bore little resemblance to Alexander's original vision. The fate of the Macedonian royal family during this period was particularly tragic, as Alexander's relatives became pawns in the political games of the successors rather than legitimate rulers in their own right. Philip III Aridaeus, the mentally disabled king, was manipulated by various factions who used his name to legitimize their own ambitions while keeping him in conditions that were little better than captivity. His wife Eurydice, a member of the Macedonian nobility who had married him for political reasons, tried to assert real authority on his behalf but was ultimately defeated and executed by Olympias, Alexander's mother, who was herself playing the succession game with characteristic Macedonian ruthlessness. Alexander IV, the infant son who should have inherited his father's empire, never had a chance to rule or even to reach adulthood. Born after Alexander's death to Roxana, a Bactrian princess whom Alexander had married for political reasons, the child was immediately caught up in the power struggles of the successors who alternately used him as a legitimizing figurehead and viewed him as a threat to their own ambitions. Cassander, who had gained control of Macedon itself, kept Alexander IV and his mother under house arrest for several years before finally having them murdered in 310 BCE, when the boy was 13 years old. The murder of Alexander IV marked the official extinction of the Argead dynasty and the end of any pretense that the successors were governing in the name of Alexander's legitimate heirs. From that point forward, The various Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from the wreckage of Alexander's empire were openly ruled by new dynasties founded by the successors themselves. The Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, and the Antigonids in Macedon all claimed to be Alexander's legitimate successors, but none could claim to be his blood relatives or the representatives of his dynasty. The irony of the Macedonian collapse was that Alexander's empire was destroyed not by external enemies or rebellious subjects, but by the very men who had been his closest companions and most trusted subordinates. The successors who tore apart his empire were not jealous rivals or foreign conquerors, but Macedonian nobles who had shared in his victories and profited from his conquests. Their inability to work together or subordinate their personal ambitions to the larger project of preserving Alexander's legacy demonstrated the fundamental weakness of a system that depended entirely on the personal authority of a single ruler. The curse that destroyed the Macedonian dynasty was thus not supernatural vengeance, but the inevitable consequence of attempting to govern an empire that was too large and diverse for the administrative and military technologies of the ancient world. Alexander's genius lay in conquest rather than governance, and his failure to prepare for succession or establish lasting institutions ensured that his empire would not survive his death. The successors who inherited fragments of his domain were individually less capable than Alexander but faced challenges that would have overwhelmed even his remarkable abilities. The legacy of Alexander's empire was not the lasting Macedonian hegemony that he had envisioned, but the creation of a new international system based on Hellenistic kingdoms that combined Greek culture with local traditions. These successor states would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East for centuries, but they were fundamentally different from Alexander's empire in their acceptance of political fragmentation and cultural diversity. The dream of a unified world empire ruled by a single Macedonian dynasty died with Alexander in Babylon, though its memory would inspire conquerors from Rome to Britain for the next 2 millennia. Chapter 9. The Tang Catastrophe When the Son of Heaven Fell to Earth. In the vermilion halls of the Daming Palace in Chang'an, where dragons coiled around golden pillars and the very air seemed perfumed with the incense of imperial authority, the Tang dynasty of China faced a crisis that would transform the Middle Kingdom from the greatest empire on earth into a fractured realm torn apart by rebellion, invasion, and political collapse. The year was 755 CE, and Emperor Xuanzong, who had ruled for 44 years as one of China's most successful monarchs, found himself confronting a military revolt led by An Lushan, a general whom he had trusted above all others. The An Lushan rebellion would rage for 8 years, claiming millions of lives and permanently destroying the political and social order that had made Tang China the wonder of the medieval world. The Tang dynasty had ruled China since 618 CE, establishing a system of government that combined military efficiency with cultural sophistication in ways that dazzled contemporary observers from Korea to Persia. Under emperors like Taizong and Xuanzong, China had expanded to its greatest territorial extent, controlling trade routes that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea while supporting a population of more than 50 million people. The Tang capital at Chang'an was the largest city in the world, with over 1 million inhabitants representing dozens of different ethnic groups and religious traditions, making it a cosmopolitan center that rivaled Rome at its height. But the very success of the Tang system contained the seeds of its own destruction, as the dynasty's commitment to expansion and cultural openness created military and political vulnerabilities that would ultimately prove fatal. The Tang military, which had conquered Central Asian kingdoms and intimidated nomadic tribes throughout the steppes, became increasingly dependent on foreign mercenaries and allied commanders whose loyalty to the Chinese imperial system was conditional and temporary. The cosmopolitan culture that made Chang'an a beacon of civilization also undermined traditional Chinese values and social structures, creating identity crises that manifested in religious conflicts and political instability. The curse that would destroy the Tang dynasty was already manifest in the person of Emperor Xuanzong himself, whose transformation from capable ruler to decadent tyrant exemplified the moral and political corruption that was consuming the imperial system. Xuanzong's early reign had been marked by military victories, administrative reforms, and cultural achievements that earned him comparison with the greatest emperors in Chinese history. But his later years were dominated by his obsession with Yang Guifei, a concubine whose beauty and intelligence captivated the aging emperor while blinding him to the political dangers that were gathering around his throne. Yang Guifei's influence over Xuanzong was not merely personal but political. as she used her position to advance the careers of her relatives and allies while undermining potential rivals within the imperial court. Her cousin Yang Guozhong became chief minister despite his obvious incompetence, while her protégé An Lushan was appointed to military commands that gave him control over the empire's most powerful armies. The emperor's infatuation with his concubine had created a shadow government that operated through personal relationships and sexual politics rather than through the merit-based bureaucracy that had made the Tang system successful. And Lushan himself embodied the contradictions and vulnerabilities of the Tang imperial system. Born to a Sogdian father and Turkic mother in the frontier regions of northeastern China, he represented the kind of cultural mixing that had given the Tang dynasty its cosmopolitan character and military effectiveness. But his foreign origins also made him an outsider within the Chinese political system, dependent on imperial favor for his position and constantly aware that his loyalty was viewed with suspicion by traditional Chinese officials who resented the influence of barbarian generals. An Lushan's rise to power was facilitated by his ability to navigate the complex factional politics of the Tang court while building a military force that was personally loyal to him rather than to the imperial system. His appointment as military commissioner of 3 northeastern provinces gave him control over nearly 200,000 troops and the resources of some of China's wealthiest regions, making him effectively an independent warlord whose continued loyalty was essential to the stability of the empire. But this same position also made him a threat to other court factions who viewed his power as a challenge to their own influence. The immediate cause of An Lushan's rebellion was his conflict with Yang Guozhong, whose incompetence as chief minister was matched only by his jealousy of the general's military success and imperial favor. Yang Guozhong's attempts to undermine An Lushan's position led to a series of political crises that forced the general to choose between submission to his enemies or open revolt against the imperial government. His decision to rebel in December 755 was not the result of long-term planning, but rather a desperate gamble by a man who believed that his survival depended on seizing supreme power before his enemies could destroy him. The rebellion that followed was catastrophic in its scope and consequences, transforming what should have been a localized military revolt into a general collapse of imperial authority throughout northern China. An Lushan's forces, composed largely of veteran frontier troops who were accustomed to warfare against nomadic enemies, proved far more effective than the palace guards and provincial militias that formed the core of loyalist resistance. Within months, the rebels had captured Luoyang, the eastern capital, and were threatening Chang'an itself, forcing Emperor Xuanzong to flee his capital in one of the most humiliating episodes in Chinese imperial history. The flight from Chang'an in July 756 marked the effective end of Xuanzong's reign and the beginning of the Tang dynasty's irreversible decline. The emperor's abandonment of his capital was not merely a tactical retreat, but a symbolic acknowledgement that the mandate of heaven had passed from the Tang ruling house to its enemies. The spectacle of the son of heaven fleeing in panic from his own palace while his capital fell to rebel forces shattered the mystique of imperial authority and demonstrated to all of China that the Tang dynasty was no longer capable of fulfilling its most basic responsibility, the maintenance of order and security. The murder of Yang Guifei during the imperial flight was both a personal tragedy for Xuanzong and a political necessity for the survival of the imperial party. The emperor's bodyguards, believing that the concubine's influence had caused the rebellion, demanded her death as the price for their continued loyalty. Xuanzong's reluctant consent to her execution represented the final destruction of the personal relationships and emotional bonds that had defined his later reign, leaving him isolated and broken, a shadow of the confident ruler who had once commanded the largest empire on earth. The rebellion continued for 8 years after An Lushan's own death in 757, as his successors and various opportunistic warlords carved up northern China, while the Tang government struggled to maintain control over the south. The eventual suppression of the revolt was achieved not through the restoration of imperial authority, but through a complex series of negotiations and compromises that left effective power in the hands of regional military commanders who nominally acknowledged Tang suzerainty while governing their territories as independent kingdoms. The human cost of the An Lushan rebellion was staggering, with contemporary estimates suggesting that the population of China declined from approximately 53 million to 17 million during the 8 years of warfare. While these figures may include refugees and displaced persons rather than actual deaths, they suggest a demographic catastrophe comparable to the worst natural disasters in human history. Entire cities were abandoned, agricultural regions were depopulated, and the sophisticated commercial networks that had made Tang China prosperous were permanently disrupted. The political consequences of the rebellion were equally devastating, as the Tang imperial system never recovered its former effectiveness or authority. The dynasty survived in name for another century and a half, but real power shifted to provincial military commissioners who governed their territories as hereditary fiefdoms while paying only nominal deference to the imperial court. The centralized bureaucracy that had been the foundation of Tang's success was replaced by a feudal system that resembled the political fragmentation of pre-imperial China more than the unified empire that the Tang founders had created. The cultural impact of the rebellion was perhaps the most profound of all, as the cosmopolitan openness that had characterized early Tang society gave way to xenophobia and cultural conservatism that viewed foreign influence as inherently dangerous and destabilizing. The Buddhist monasteries that had flourished under imperial patronage were closed or destroyed, foreign merchants were expelled from Chinese cities, and the Silk Road trade routes that had connected China to the outside world were abandoned or fell under the control of nomadic peoples who cared nothing for Chinese cultural achievements. The curse that destroyed the Tang dynasty was not supernatural vengeance, but the inevitable consequence of political and military systems that had grown too complex and expensive to sustain. The empire's commitment to territorial expansion had created military obligations that drained the imperial treasury while empowering regional commanders who could challenge central authority. The cosmopolitan culture that had made Tang China attractive to foreign peoples and ideas had also undermined traditional Chinese values and social structures, creating identity crises that manifested in political instability and social conflict. The Enlushan Rebellion represented the failure of the Chinese imperial system to adapt to the challenges created by its own success. The Tang dynasty had created an empire that was too large to govern effectively with pre-modern administrative and communication technologies, while its military system had evolved in ways that made rebellion not only possible but almost inevitable. The tragedy of the Tang collapse was not that it was caused by external enemies or natural disasters, but that it was the result of internal contradictions and systemic weaknesses that had been building for generations before finally exploding in 8 years of unprecedented destruction and chaos. Chapter 10. The Merovingian Twilight, when sacred kings became powerless phantoms. In the mist-shrouded forests of Francia, where ancient Celtic druids had once performed blood sacrifices beneath sacred oaks and Roman legions had marched along roads that were already crumbling into wilderness, the most mysterious and powerful dynasty in early medieval Europe began its final descent into irrelevance and obscurity. The Merovingians, who claimed descent from both Germanic war gods and the divine bloodline of Christ himself, had ruled the Frankish kingdoms for more than 3 centuries, transforming barbarian tribes into Christian kingdoms while wielding powers that seemed to transcend the ordinary boundaries between the sacred and the secular. But by the middle of the 8th century, these god-kings had become little more than ceremonial figures, manipulated by ambitious mayors of the palace who exercised real power while leaving the legitimate rulers to live as prisoners in their own palaces. The Merovingian dynasty had risen to power through a combination of military conquest, religious authority, and supernatural charisma that made them unlike any other royal house in European history. Their founder, Merovech, was said to have been conceived when his mother was seduced by a sea monster while swimming in the ocean, giving him divine parentage that elevated him above ordinary mortals. His descendants inherited not just kingdoms but magical powers that included the ability to heal the sick, control the weather, and communicate with spirits, making them living bridges between the world of men and the realm of the gods. The most famous of the Merovingian kings was Clovis I, who united the Frankish tribes under his rule and converted to Christianity in a move that transformed both his dynasty and the entire future of European civilization. Clovis's baptism in 496 CE was not merely a personal religious decision but a political masterstroke that aligned the Frankish kingdom with the Catholic Church and the surviving Roman administration in Gaul. This alliance gave the Merovingians access to Roman bureaucratic expertise and Christian legitimacy while providing the Church with military protection and political support. But the very success of the Merovingian conversion to Christianity contained the seeds of the dynasty's ultimate destruction. The Church's acceptance of Merovingian rule came with conditions that gradually undermined the king's traditional sources of power while creating new forms of authority that could be exercised by non-royal officials. The Christianization of Frankish society meant that the Merovingians could no longer claim divine powers that were incompatible with Christian theology. while the Church's insistence on moral behavior and religious orthodoxy limited the king's freedom of action in ways that proved politically disastrous. The curse that would destroy the Merovingians manifested first in their adoption of the Roman practice of dividing kingdoms among multiple heirs, a system that had worked for the pagan Germanic tribes but proved catastrophic when applied to Christian kingdoms that required unity and central authority. Each generation of Merovingian rulers divided their territories among their sons, creating multiple kingdoms that were constantly at war with each other while facing external threats from Lombards, Visigoths, and Saracens who could exploit Frankish disunity to advance their own territorial ambitions. These fratricidal conflicts were not merely political disputes but religious wars, as competing Merovingian claimants sought legitimacy through alliances with different factions within the Catholic Church. The result was a series of civil wars that devastated Francia while empowering ecclesiastical officials who could play different kings against each other. Bishops and abbots accumulated wealth and political influence, while the Merovingian kings exhausted their resources fighting each other, creating a power imbalance that would ultimately prove fatal to royal authority. The most destructive of these conflicts was the war between Brunhild of Austrasia and Fredegund of Neustria, two queens whose 40-year struggle for supremacy demonstrated both the potential strength and the ultimate weakness of Merovingian women. Brunhild was a Visigothic princess who had married into the Merovingian family and used her intelligence and political skill to dominate Austrasian politics for decades. Fredegund was a former slave who had become queen through her beauty and ruthlessness, eliminating rivals through assassination while building a power base among the Frankish nobility. The conflict between these two extraordinary women was conducted through methods that included assassination, torture, and warfare on a scale that shocked even contemporaries who were accustomed to the violence of early medieval politics. Brunhild and Fredegund arranged the murders of each other's husbands, children, and supporters while building alliances with foreign powers who were eager to exploit Frankish weakness. Their war finally ended in 613 with Brunhild's capture and execution, but the damage to Merovingian prestige and authority was irreparable. By the 7th century, the Merovingian kings had become increasingly dependent on their chief ministers, known as mayors of the palace, who exercised executive authority while the kings retreated into ceremonial roles. This development was initially justified as a temporary expedient that would allow the sacred kings to focus on religious and ritual duties while practical administration was handled by competent subordinates. But the mayor of the palace gradually evolved into a hereditary position that accumulated power and resources while the kings became increasingly isolated and powerless. The most successful of these mayors of the palace was Charles Martel, whose military victories against Saracen invaders at the Battle of Tours in 732 established him as the defender of Christian Europe and the real ruler of Francia. Charles's defeat of the Muslim armies that had conquered Spain and seemed poised to overrun Gaul was a triumph that earned him international recognition as the savior of Christianity. But it also demonstrated that effective military leadership had passed from the Merovingian kings to their supposed subordinates. Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, completed the process of Merovingian marginalization by seeking papal approval for his usurpation of royal authority. In 751, Pope Zachary declared that whoever exercised real power should also hold the royal title, effectively legitimizing Pepin's deposition of the last Merovingian king, Childeric III. This papal intervention was presented as a restoration of proper order, but it actually represented a revolutionary change in the nature of European kingship, as hereditary divine right was replaced by ecclesiastical approval as the source of royal legitimacy. The deposition of Childeric III in 751 marked the official end of Merovingian rule, but the dynasty's decline had been evident for decades before the final coup. The last Merovingian kings, known as the Do-Nothing Kings or Roisfanians, had been reduced to ceremonial figureheads who appeared in public only for ritual occasions while real power was exercised by others. Their confinement to rural estates, where they lived in comfortable obscurity while receiving royal honors, was presented as a merciful alternative to execution, but it represented the complete negation of the sacred kingship that had been the foundation of Merovingian authority. The tragedy of the Merovingian decline was not that the dynasty was destroyed by external enemies or popular rebellion, but that it was gradually hollowed out by the very institutions and alliances that had initially strengthened royal power. The Church's support for Merovingian rule came with requirements for moral behavior and religious orthodoxy that limited the king's freedom of action, while the aristocracy's military service was purchased through grants of land and authority that eventually made the nobles more powerful than their royal masters. The Merovingian acceptance of Roman administrative practices and Christian theological constraints represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the sources of their own authority. The sacred kingship that had made the Merovingians powerful was based on their ability to transcend ordinary human limitations through divine favor and supernatural abilities. When they accepted Christian theology that denied the possibility of such powers, they undermined the very foundation of their legitimacy while failing to develop alternative sources of authority that could sustain their rule. The Carolingian dynasty that replaced the Merovingians represented a completely different conception of kingship, based on military effectiveness and ecclesiastical approval rather than sacred bloodline and supernatural powers. Charlemagne's coronation as emperor in 800 marked the triumph of this new model of Christian kingship, but it also represented the final extinction of the ancient traditions that had sustained European monarchy for centuries before the arrival of Christianity. The curse that destroyed the Merovingians was not supernatural vengeance, but the inevitable consequence of trying to maintain sacred authority within a Christian framework that denied the possibility of divine kingship. Their gradual decline from god-kings to ceremonial figureheads demonstrated that political authority cannot survive the destruction of its ideological foundations, no matter how deeply rooted in tradition or how broadly accepted by contemporary society. Epilogue: the eternal return of royal curses. As we emerge from our journey through the sepulchral halls of dynastic history, where the ghosts of 10 royal houses whisper their tales of glory transformed into nightmare, we must pause to consider what these chronicles of destruction reveal about the very nature of power itself. From the blood-soaked stones of Tudor England to the vermilion pillars of Tang China, from the mirrored halls of Versailles to the incestuous chambers of Ptolemaic Egypt, we have witnessed the same inexorable pattern repeated across cultures, centuries, and continents. The rise of dynasties that claimed divine sanction, their corruption by the very power they wielded, and their ultimate destruction by forces they had created but could not control. Each of these 10 cursed bloodlines began with promise, seized power through some combination of military conquest, political genius, or historical accident, and established systems of government that seemed destined to endure for eternity. The Tudors broke with Rome and established England as a Protestant power. The Romanovs created the largest empire in human history. The Habsburgs ruled territories on which the sun never set. The Bourbons made France the cultural center of Europe. The Stuarts united England and Scotland under a single crown. The Valois fought the 100 Years' War and survived. The Ptolemies governed Egypt for 3 centuries as living gods. The Macedonians conquered the known world under Alexander. The Tang presided over China's golden age. The Merovingians Christianized the barbarian kingdoms of Europe. Yet despite their achievements, their wealth, their military power, and their claims to divine favor, every one of these dynasties was ultimately consumed by the same fundamental contradictions that seem to plague all attempts at absolute rule. Power, which was supposed to solve their problems and secure their future, instead became the instrument of their destruction. The very qualities that elevated them above ordinary mortals, their ambition, their sense of destiny, their willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve their goals, ultimately proved to be the seeds of their own annihilation. The pattern is so consistent across time and culture that it seems to reveal something profound about the nature of human authority itself. Perhaps the curse that follows royal blood is not supernatural at all, but rather the inevitable consequence of believing that some human beings are fundamentally different from others, that political power confers moral authority, or that earthly success reflects divine approval. Each of these dynasties fell victim to the same fatal delusion, that they could transcend the limitations and responsibilities that govern ordinary human existence. Consider how each curse manifested differently yet followed the same essential logic. The Tudors' obsession with male heirs led Henry VIII to break with 1,000 years of Christian tradition, murder 2 wives, and unleash religious conflicts that raged for generations. But this obsession was itself the product of believing that royal blood carried special properties that made dynastic continuity more important than human life or moral law. The curse was not Henry's inability to produce sons. It was his conviction that producing sons justified any action, however monstrous. The Romanovs' destruction came through their absolute commitment to autocratic rule in an age when such government had become impossible to maintain. Nicholas II was not evil or incompetent in any conventional sense. He was simply incapable of understanding that the world had changed in ways that made his conception of monarchy obsolete. The curse was not the Russian Revolution. It was the dynasty's inability to adapt to historical forces that made revolution inevitable. The Habsburgs' genetic catastrophe resulted from their belief that royal blood was so precious that it must be preserved through incestuous marriage rather than refreshed through unions with commoners. The curse was not the hereditary disorders that afflicted later generations. It was the arrogance that led them to believe that political considerations could override biological reality. The Bourbons' destruction in the French Revolution came from their complete isolation from the people they claimed to rule. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were not monsters. They were simply so disconnected from ordinary human experience that they could not comprehend the suffering their policies caused or the anger their indifference generated. The curse was not the revolution. It was the system of absolute monarchy that made such disconnection inevitable. Each dynasty's story reveals a different facet of the same fundamental problem. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, not because it makes people evil, but because it makes them inhuman. When individuals or families believe themselves to be above the normal constraints of morality, law, or natural limitation, they inevitably make decisions that seem rational from their elevated perspective but prove catastrophic when judged by ordinary human standards. The sexual perversions of the Ptolemies, the genetic disasters of the Habsburgs, the political blindness of the Bourbons, the religious extremism of the Tudors. All of these were the logical consequences of systems that told rulers they were gods rather than mortals, that their desires were more important than their subjects' needs, and that their dynasty's survival justified any sacrifice of individual human dignity or welfare. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these royal curses is how they reveal the complicity of entire societies in their own oppression. None of these dynasties ruled alone. They were supported by armies of courtiers, officials, soldiers, and subjects who enabled their excesses, covered up their crimes, and participated in the systems that ultimately destroyed both rulers and ruled. The curse that followed royal blood was also a curse on the societies that accepted, celebrated, and served these dysfunctional systems of government. The courtiers who flattered Henry VIII while he murdered his wives, the nobles who participated in Habsburg incest while knowing it was destroying the dynasty, the bureaucrats who served the Romanov autocracy while it led Russia toward revolution, the revolutionaries who cheered as they destroyed the Bourbons while creating even worse tyranny. All of these were participants in the same fundamental delusion that some human beings are more than human and that earthly power reflects divine favor. Yet these stories also reveal something hopeful about human nature: the ultimate impossibility of maintaining systems based on fundamental lies about human equality and dignity. Every one of these dynasties eventually faced a reckoning with reality that no amount of wealth, military power, or ideological sophistication could prevent. The Tudor obsession with male heirs led to the extinction of their line. The Habsburg commitment to genetic purity resulted in genetic catastrophe. The Romanov belief in autocracy provoked revolution. The Bourbon isolation from their people generated popular fury that consumed them. In each case, the curse was not imposed from outside but generated from within, as the contradictions inherent in absolute rule eventually became so severe that they could no longer be contained or concealed. The dynasty's destruction was not the result of bad luck or supernatural intervention, but the inevitable consequence of political and social systems that violated basic truths about human nature and social organization. This suggests that the real lesson of these cursed dynasties is not that power inevitably corrupts, but that certain kinds of power, absolute, hereditary, unaccountable power, are inherently unsustainable because they require societies to accept fundamental lies about human equality, dignity, and capability. The curse that follows royal blood is actually the curse that follows any attempt to create permanent hierarchies based on birth rather than merit, inherited privilege rather than earned authority, or mystical claims rather than demonstrated competence. The modern world has largely abandoned the forms of absolute monarchy represented by these 10 dynasties, but the underlying temptations they represent remain as powerful as ever. The belief that some people are fundamentally superior to others, that success reflects moral worth, that power justifies its own exercise, these delusions continue to shape contemporary politics, economics, and social organization in ways that would be familiar to the courtiers who served these long-dead kings and queens. The curse that destroyed the Tudors, Romanovs, Habsburgs, Bourbons, Stuarts, Valois, Ptolemies, Macedonians, Tang, and Merovingians is still active in our world, manifesting in different forms but following the same essential logic. It appears wherever human beings convince themselves that their temporary success makes them permanently superior, that their current power gives them the right to rule over others, or that their group's interests justify the oppression of other groups. The royal crypts may be empty now, the golden thrones may rest in museums, and the dynasties may be extinct, but the forces that destroyed them remain as dangerous as ever. The curse that follows power continues to claim victims, and it will continue to do so until human societies learn to organize themselves around principles of equality, accountability, and shared humanity rather than hierarchy, privilege, and inherited authority. In the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson these cursed dynasties have to teach us: that no one is chosen by God to rule over others, that no bloodline carries divine properties, and that no amount of earthly success can exempt anyone from the fundamental responsibilities of human membership. The kings and queens whose stories we have told tonight believed themselves to be gods, but they died as mortals, leaving behind only the warning their lives provide about the eternal human temptation to mistake temporary power for permanent authority. The curse of royal blood is ultimately the curse of believing that some mortals are immortal, that some humans are superhuman, and that earthly kingdoms can last forever. It is a curse that can only be broken by accepting the fundamental equality of all human beings and organizing our societies around principles that acknowledge both our shared mortality and our common dignity. Until we learn this lesson, the curse will continue to claim new victims, and the pattern of rise, corruption, and fall will repeat itself in forms both ancient and modern, forever and ever, world without end.